Today I'll be speaking to you about logic and theology, and these are two very complicated abstract topics that I hope to ground and show you how they're valuable and purposeful for your own lives, as well as what they mean and how we can understand them, and how understanding them gives us a window into not only thinking reasonably, discovering that which is true, but also being able to find reasonable grounds for belief in God, and why it is that we might have a greater certainty in our lives, both in our prayers and our practice. So this is a quote from the Gospel of John. "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." We should not be afraid of the truth. We should look to find it. And in finding it, we should hope that we should find freedom for the sources that inhibit our lives by concealing from us that which is true, and also denying to us the way of discovering how we should act in relation to the world and for our better ends. Tonight I'll be discussing with you three topics: a theological interpretation of logic, or theology of logic, which was the topic of my doctoral dissertation at Cambridge. The second is the various forms of logic, how we can use logic to think reasonably, and what ways we can use logic to make sense of the world. And the third is what logic teaches us about theology, so the logic of theology, and why it's useful for thinking about God and how that inspires us in our lives. So before we begin, I want to give you an illustration of the sort of grandeur of the universe and what this shows us not only about science, but also about thinking reasonably about God. That was a scene scored by the Greek composer Vangelis of a television series that appeared in the 1980s called Cosmos by the famous astronomer and popularizer of science Carl Sagan. And there is a song that's been made by a band called For a Symphony of Science called The Glorious Dawn. It says, "A still more glorious dawn awaits, not a sunrise but a galaxy rise, a morning filled with 400 billion suns, the rising of the Milky Way." Imagine if you were, for instance, on a spaceship traveling beyond the Milky Way galaxy, and you were able to see, as it were, all of the galaxies strewn out on the horizon. You could see not just the rising of a single star, but 400 billion stars at once. And as we know from the James Webb Telescope that has been launched this past year, it's now possible to look into any point of darkness in the night sky and find billions and billions of galaxies which contain hundreds of billions of stars. So the universe is vast, the mysteries that await us are unprecedented, and there is unknown possibilities yet to be discovered by humanity, and things yet to be learned that will await us ever afterwards. So when confronting the vastness of the universe, we are called upon to think about the sublime depths not only of the exterior void, but also of our own selves. That is, what it awaits us to discover, and what is the call upon us to think about ourselves. How, in searching into the vastness of space, do we see something about the depth and grandeur of ourselves? The famous philosopher Immanuel Kant once said that when he looks up to the starry skies above, he sees the mysterious depths within. Today I want to ask you what this means for us. What does science mean for us? And what can the way that we can think reasonably about the world help us to understand not only about the world, but also about ourselves in relation to God? So oftentimes when people today are interested in the world, when they want to know what is true and who can tell them what is true, they look not to theologians, to priests, or to the spiritual leaders of the world, whether it be their family, their parents, and so on, but rather look to the authority of natural science, that is, to the famous physicist. You may often see that when the great questions of the world arise, whether they be in astrobiology, or whether it be in cosmology or physics, but even in questions of politics and business, we call upon the authority of natural scientists as though they are the great high priests. And they have been so for many centuries because we've, as it were, ceded the authority of what can be known and who knows it to a kind of guild of natural scientists who have the pretense of having certain knowledge of the world. So, for instance, Albert Einstein was asked about his views on Palestine and Israel, even though he was a mathematician who derived theories about the folding of space-time. So what I would suggest is that the sciences are not restricted to the natural sciences, and we can see this very clearly in the history of philosophy. I teach a course, for instance, on the origins of modern science, but also in the very method by which the sciences operate. So if you were to ask someone what is science, they would typically say something like the hypothetical experimental method of investigating the natural world. So we observe things in the world, we hypothesize what could be the universal laws that make it so, and then we devise experiments by which to test whether or not it conforms to those hypotheses. And this is one mode of logic called induction, that is, a way of reasoning from particulars to universal. But it's by no means the only mode of logic. And according to Aristotle and Plato and all logicians until the present day, it's always been considered to be not a certain and necessary way of reasoning about the world, but only a probabilistic way of understanding the world. One easy way to understand this is if you were to be asked, how do you know that the sun will rise? You could say that I know the sun will rise because it's always risen in the past. And indeed, for the whole history of humanity, it's always risen in the past. However, there's a more certain way of knowing the sun will rise, which is not based on experience alone, not based on mere probability, but rather based on the certain knowledge of physics, the mathematical models we have about the physical universe, and celestial mechanics that shows us that as the Earth moves around the sun and rotates, that we know that its face will continue to return back to the sun. This higher mode of reasoning is called deductive reasoning, that is reasoning from universals to particulars, or according to the universal ideas themselves. And it's this kind of reasoning that logic is the primary science of. So, logic is a way of coming to know the truth of things, coming to know what is true, not only of the world, but absolutely of God as its creator and its final purpose. What is logic? So when people talk about logic today, they often mean something like a way of reasoning. And that's an informal way of talking about logic. There's a more formal way that philosophers have investigated since the time of Aristotle, which is according to the way we calculate how conclusions can be derived of necessity from the premises that are previously assumed. So assuming that there are certain things that we hold to be true, what would follow from the way in which the elements of those premises are both divided and recombined to produce new consequences? Now, logic today is often thought to be a purely mathematical science, most famously in the work of Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead. They composed a book called Principia Mathematica, which derived on the basis of set theory and formal mathematics a complete system of logic. So they thought it was complete until it was found to be incomplete due to a number of paradoxes that arose in the 1920s. This here is an excerpt from the book from page 379, where Bertrand Russell deduces that 1 plus 1 equals 2, and he says that this proposition will sometimes be found useful. Okay, so what is theology? Most people think that theology is a kind of Harry Potter science, a kind of arcana of bearded old men usually who, like for instance, the Kensington Priory, who spend all their days praying and burying their nose in the Bible. They don't think that theology is reasonable, for one. They don't think it's scientific, that it can show us anything with certainty. And they also don't think it has any authority, because we dispense with the authority of theology today. We tend to think that pop stars and physicists and business moguls have more authority than the Pope, or more authority than the priest, or even your grandmother. I would argue that theology is the queen of the sciences, that it holds a higher authority than all natural science, physics included, because it provides, through revelation and the self-revelation of God in scripture, in tradition, a way of thinking reasonably about the world and about how we come to know God within the world. This is a painting by the great Renaissance artist Raphael, the Dissertation of the Holy Sacrament. It's in the Apostolic Palace across from the Academy of Athens, and it presents the great theologians of the past disputing the nature of the Blessed Sacrament, which previously had been the subject of our adoration in the Kensington Priory. And you can see that it's crowned by the apostles, by the glorious martyrs and saints, and ultimately by Mary, Jesus, and God and the Trinity, as well as the angels and saints. So it presents, as it were, a hierarchical model of how, through investigation into these questions, using argument, using logic, we can come to a progressive knowledge of the world, and also the world that is shaped through these various heavenly powers that give meaning to our lives. So, what is theology of logic? My doctoral dissertation was on the way that Christian theologians examined and used logic for Christian theology, not just as a way of arguing, but as a way of coming to a more certain knowledge of their faith. Theology of logic is, in short, a theological interpretation of logic. If there is no pure nature, no nature that stands totally apart from God, and also no pure natural reason, no way of thinking that is not always already created with purpose, suffused by grace and informed by revelation, then even the way we used the symbolic forms of logic are directed for the purposes of theology. That is, they can be interpreted in light of and for those sacred ends, also within religious communities for the purpose of prayer, sacraments, and rituals. So in contrast to secular reason, logic can be interpreted for theology. God can be called the originator, ground, and final purpose of the forms of logic. There are no pure secular sciences. All science, as it were, points to the higher truth that's shown by revelation in theology. So theology can, in contrast to philosophy, be called the queen of the sciences. And this dates back to Cicero and to the vision of Mercury and the Boethius and the medieval university, where all of the sciences are related to what they call the quadrivium and the trivium. The trivium being the study of grammar, of rhetoric, and of dialectic. Dialectic being the way in which we argue for and against our theses. And the quadrivium being composed of the abstract sciences of arithmetic and music on the one hand, and geometry and astronomy on the other hand, the concrete sciences. Altogether, the grammatical, rhetorical, and dialectical investigation into the subject, that is arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy, would give you a complete view of the entire universe. Now, with that being said, philosophy was thought to be the highest of the sciences, in as far as the philosophy alone was able to ask the absolute questions of the first premises and presuppositions of all of the other sciences. So if you think critically about what is physics, if you ask what does physics absolutely assume, physics must assume that there are things that are in motion, that there are forces, that there are causes, but physics cannot prove that. Physics simply takes it for granted. Philosophy alone can ask why it is that there are things rather than nothing, and what causes those things to be. But theology is higher still, in that theology shows us not just what can be said about the world reasonably, but also how that what we say about the world is true. That is, not merely that there is being rather than nothing, or that being can be thought of in various relations, but that there must be beings because it is a gift from the author of being, the Lord of being, which has given it and created it from nothing. So in this sense, theology was called the queen of the sciences, of which philosophy was its highest handmaid. And this is the vision of the sciences that I wish to present to you today. Oftentimes in the university and secular academy, there's a jostling of authority between sciences. Theology is often disregarded, but I want to champion the role of theology as being of the highest importance for our lives. So, the forms of logic. So, we often today think that science, and what we can know reasonably, is something that stands apart from the questions of faith and religion and how we live in the world. We think of it as though it's something that we can find in a textbook, something that anyone can understand regardless of their traditions, their beliefs, and their practices. We also tend to think that it is in no way related to or even compromises the teachings of the church and sacred doctrine. So, for instance, in biology, people will say that evolutionary theory directly contradicts Christian teachings, and that Christian teachings has to be, as it were, put on the side or suspended. We cannot believe them when we go into the science classroom. In the medieval university, and for Thomas Aquinas, the great Dominican theologian of the 13th century, they held a completely different view of this. They saw that the highest science was called sacra doctrina, that is, sacred doctrine. And we began not by thinking about the world as though it stood apart from, in a sort of neutral sphere of infinite understanding, apart from God, but rather we start from what God has told to us through Scripture, through the ministry and teachings of Christ, the church, the apostles, and the traditions that have grown up through the conciliar teachings of the church through time. So he described sacra doctrina as, just as the musician accepts on authority the principles taught by him by the mathematician, so sacred science is established on the principles revealed by God. That is, it's not something that is known by, like arithmetic, that can be established by a flat understanding of the world, rather something that is shown to us from a higher source, something that shines through the ordinary world and for which the understanding that arises through a community of faith responding to that source of revelation. Since Thomas Aquinas, and since the Middle Ages, we have entered into a period which we call modernity, which is in many ways shaped by a negative or abstract way of thinking about these forms of reason as they've arisen due to the rupture of religious traditions following the Renaissance and following the wars of religion. And in many ways, this was inspired by an attempt to reach out beyond the confession of the Christian faith, learn about the world in a way that wasn't compromised by these disputes. It grew up from a number of thinkers, and in the sphere of logic, there are some that are of pivotal importance, and I'll name just a few. William of Ockham and John Buridan, stand at the end of what is called the high medieval synthesis, the rupture between the university, the theology faculty on the one hand, philosophy on the other hand, the church and the empire, and they devised what for ever since has can be considered to be the philosophical study of logic, which is indifferent to and takes no assumptions from theology. We can call this secular logic. In Gottfried Leibniz, we have the development of a purely formal mathematical and analytical understanding of logic that has no recourse to and ultimately is extrinsically related to the monad of monads or the supreme being from which it proceeds. And in Immanuel Kant, we have a way of reflecting upon to discover the hypothetical basis for the forms of reason that shape our understanding of the natural world, and for which the questions of theology only enter in extrinsically as a source of the appearances that have to be themselves uncovered through various levels of rational analysis. These thinkers have given to posterity, and up until our time, a way of thinking about logic that is separate from theology, arguably both in the analytic traditions following Gottlob Frege and in the continental traditions following Edmund Husserl. We have a way of thinking in a purely formal register, of which the forms are not themselves infused by or directed for the purposes of theology, of the way of thinking reasonably about the world and discovering its truth. And it's only recently that we've begun to reinterrogate this legacy and discover at what points they've made theological mistakes that call for a theological reinterrogation. So, looking back at the forms of logic, there are arguably three different kinds that grew up in antiquity, and arguably also three kinds that still remain with us today. So in antiquity, you will have known about Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. There were three kinds of logic that grew up. One was amongst the followers of Plato, one amongst the followers of Aristotle, and there was a third kind that grew up very famously amongst the followers of Zeno of Citium and Chrysippus of Soli. Sadly, the works of Chrysippus, of which there are reported to be about 600 in antiquity, have been completely lost to us, except for a few fragments. However, his legacy was revived by a great German mathematician named Gottlob Frege, who contributed and authored what has come to be known as mathematical logic, or the quantified predicate calculus. And mathematical logic is what we think logic is today, and it's often taken as the pure form of logic, unqualifiedly. But I want to argue that it is a specific kind of logic for which the form of logic can in fact be assumed into and derives its higher truth from the logic of Aristotle and of Plato. So the first kind of logic that I want to discuss with you is called dialectic. So in Plato's dialogues, he frames a way of arguing that is presented by Socrates for and against theses. When someone proposes an answer to the question, for instance, of what is justice, what is virtue, what is beauty, Socrates will then argue for and against it. And in arguing against it, he'll show that certain assumptions that we take for granted about what beauty is, what justice is, result in a contradiction. That contradiction then shows the assumptions to be in conflict with where those assumptions lead, such that if you hold that assumption, what follows as a consequence of that assumption is a subverting of the ground of truth that you formerly held to be so. And this leads to a kind of inner agony, which also points to multiple paths of resolution, which he calls an aporia, that is, two paths that could be traveled to find a way out of that internal conflict that you have. Now, dialectic has often been thought of in a very abstract sense as a way of dividing and combining on the one hand, or arguing for and against different theses of a belief. But the way that Plato presents it in the Sophist, for instance, as well as in the Phaedrus, and then later on in Timaeus, is in a much more concrete and physical sense. He describes it in the Phaedrus, for instance, as like a butcher that rather than just hacking the head of the cow off, or whatever limb it likes, chooses to cut the animal at its joints. That is, we can only cut the world, not however we wish, not just hacking it to pieces, but we have to find a way to cut it that fits with the world as it already is. So, for instance, you cannot just say that this chair is green, that the walls are elephantine, or that a man is like a giraffe. That wouldn't make sense, because the categories don't fit together. The way that we're talking about the world doesn't cohere with the way in which we name those things. Rather, we have to use words in such a way that they fit within other categories that give them meaning. So, for instance, you can only talk about moving through space if you talk about cardinalities, moving up, down, left, and right. You can only talk about colors if you talk about growing lighter or warmer, colder or darker, etc. So Plato proposed that for every term we can define it. We can define it by taking a more generic notion of that term and then dividing it into its species and then combining those specific differentia into a more composite unity that would make sense of it. So in the case of a man, what he says in the Sophist is a man is that a man is like an animal, but it's not a wild animal, it's a tame animal. It's not a swimming animal, nor is it a winged animal, but it's a footed animal. And it's not a four-footed animal like a horse, but it's a two-footed animal. Now, this doesn't tell you exactly what a man is. Of course, there's very little that could be said to give you exactly what the nature of a man is. But it does tell you what a man is not. A man is not a horse. A man is not a dolphin. A man is not a wild animal. So later Aristotle will say that a man is a rational animal and also a political animal. The man becomes who man is through politics, that is, through engaging within a rational community with other men that can recognize them and help them become who they are in a community of virtue that strive to be better all the time. This will later be developed into a way of talking about being, about what is and is not, what is itself and other than itself, as well as one and many in the Parmenides. And all of these ways of dividing are a way of, as it were, taking the original unity of the entire universe, not just of any particular part, dividing it into its various elements, and then recombining that in an orderly way, such that that order shows you what those things are. For instance, in the Timaeus, Plato will say that we can take a circle, we can divide it, we can take a point, we can stretch it into a line, we can take a line, we can unfold that into a triangle by extending one of its sides to form three sides rather than just two. And we can take the triangle, we can fold that further on another dimension to form an icyclohedron. We can take that and we can combine it in various different ways to form more complex geometrical constructions. And these various geometrical constructions can be demonstrated to cohere in every complex geometrical pattern. And through this, we can construct a geometrical model of the universe. And he gives many other examples about how the elements of language, how the elements of argument can be combined in order to find a pattern, a form to describe the universe. And all of these are ways in which, as it were, the universe in its abstract immediacy, its generic wholeness, can be divided into various shapes and forms and then recombined in more complex ways to give us a better picture of how the world really is. This is what he calls dialectic, that is, a way of arguing in between speeches in order to come to a more mixed and rich understanding of the world as it's come to be through the process of its division and recombination and the mixture of its more complex unity. After Plato, Aristotle, his great successor, who started his own school at the Lyceum, developed what we consider to be classical logic. That is, the logic that has come down to us and has been called until the 19th century the foremost kind of logic, which is the logic of the syllogism. Now, the syllogism is what our great-grandparents and people who came before the early 20th century would have thought logic was, before the development of mathematical logic. It was a way of dividing the basic things that could be said about the world and into what is the subject of speech, that which we're speaking of, that which does not refer to anything other than itself, the predicates, that is, what is said of another, something else, and also how it is said of, or of what things it is said of, in what extent. So the basic elements of the syllogism are the subject, in this case we'll take men, the predicate, mortals, and also the extent of which it can be said, which can be said all or some. Now, Aristotle found that if you were to divide and combine these in different ways, you could array two premises or two statements in such a way that the combination of them, insofar as they share a middle term, could allow for the elements to be divided and recombined in such a way that the truth of the first two premises would, of necessity, produce the truth of the third premise from what is assumed in a new and novel way. So in this case, what we have is, if you assume that all men are mortals, and you assume that all Greeks are men, then because the minor premise shares the middle term with the major premise, namely men, if all men are mortals, and of those men, there are Greeks who are men, and we say that all men are mortals and Greeks are some men, then it follows from this that all Greeks who are a particular part, some of all men, are also mortals. Now notice that the conclusion is not stated amongst the premises. The conclusion is only a virtual consequence of the relation of the terms of the first premises, but which requires that we should look at the premises, analyze them, and recombine them in such a way that the conclusion is the result of those premises. What Aristotle showed in his great works, the prior analytics and the posterior analytics, what has been called Aristotle's organon or instrument, is that there are a number of valid syllogisms which obtain regardless of what terms we apply to them, and for which, whenever an argument is in that form, the consequence will necessarily be true. And this allows for a kind of mnemonic automation of how we know the truth of a conclusion. regardless of what we think about the terms, if we have an argument to that form, the conclusion must be true simply according to the form alone. And here's a way of illustrating that form. Here it's illustrated in Venn diagrams, and I won't go over all the details with you. The important point is that if you take this and this to be the major and minor premises, and you combine them, you form this, which is the conclusion, which is formed from the combination of the former two and produces a new conclusion, which is not previously assumed. This is the same argument in mathematical logic, and I'll get to that in just a minute. Okay. So, since the time of Aristotle and through the Middle Ages, people assumed that logic was fundamentally a logic of a syllogism. That is a way of making statements that can be formed of premises, and then combining and dividing them in such a way that the conclusion followed necessity. And they argued, in some cases, about some of the more uncertain forms of the syllogism, as well as how it could be applied in rhetoric. And there's the history of logic goes back and forth between both investigating the forms of the syllogism and disregarding or elevating them and recombining them in various different ways. However, in the 19th century, there was a new movement of formal mathematics that derived apart from German philosophers and German mathematicians, but took hold also in Cambridge in the 19th century. George Boole, we may know from Boolean algebra, was one, but also Gottlob Frege, who I mentioned previously in Germany, pioneered a new way of thinking about the pure algebraical form of the syllogism. And what he was able to show, specifically in the case of Gottlob Frege and his Polish successors, was that all of the forms of the syllogism could in fact be more rigorously described using modern algebra, using a fine kind of algebra that was pioneered by Georg Cantor called set theory. And these are some of the formula for using mathematical logic. And I won't go through all of them for you. I just wanted to illustrate some of the basic forms, how they can translate from English to fourth-order logic, for instance. This is what is called modus ponens. It's the basic argument of Stoic logic, which is P, if P, then Q, therefore Q. So if we assume that Ryan is in the room, and if Ryan is in the room, then Ryan is speaking to you, and we know that Ryan is in the room, then Ryan must be speaking to you. That's the basic form of the argument. This here is an extension of first-order logic using what are called modal quantifiers, which are necessary and possible. This is a famous argument by an Austrian mathematician named Kurt Gödel, and we'll get to this later. He developed a form of the ontological argument, proof for God's existence, using this form of mathematical logic. And this is his argument in short, and the conclusion here is necessarily God exists. Okay. So, I know it's funny, right? In a certain sense, logic can be seen as a kind of parlor trick because we're using these symbols to sort of generate, as it were, conjure the genie out of thin air. And there's reasons to be skeptical about this. And the great Cardinal and St. Henry Newman once commented in A Grammar of Assent, quote, "Logic then does not really prove it. It enables us to join issues with another. It suggests ideas, opens views, it maps out for us the lines of thought. It verifies negatively, it determines when differences of opinion are hopeless, and when how far conclusions are probable. But for genuine proof in concrete matters, we require an organon, more delicate, versatile, and elastic than verbal argumentation. That is, we have to assent through our will to believe that which we prove with logic to be true." This is where I think that logic becomes something more than merely a parlor trick, more than merely a way of scribbling on the wall to conjure God out of thin air. It becomes a way of thinking about what those forms mean for us, how we understand the world, and how the forms of thought by which we understand the world help us to gain an insight into what we will to believe. So I would argue that these forms of logic are not separate from one another, that the form of mathematical logic is not entirely indifferent to dialectic, not indifferent to the way we would carve up the world into its forms, and also not indifferent to the way that in investigating the forms of the world, we come to know about the form of understanding by which we can know not only the world, but also the way we can understand God as its creator and our purpose within it. So I want to argue more specifically that mathematical logic is a subset kind of the syllogism, namely a mathematical or quantified syllogism, that the syllogism is itself a kind of simulated dialectic. It's a way of dividing, combining, mixing, and then automating that process through the way that we analyze what we assume and what follows of necessity from our assumption. And if that's the case, then these forms of logic are not three episodes of possible thought, possible ways of formulating the world, but rather each are coinciding, coincident and circumscribed and gathered up into one and the other. This leads to a more dynamic picture of the history of philosophy, one in which there is not only a gradual unfolding, specification, and complex development of the way we think reasonably about science, God, and the world, but also in a way that modern science and mathematics, and even mathematical logic, are ways by which we can come to know God more richly. So if mathematical logic is itself a kind of symbolic, formal automation of the syllogism, namely when the syllogism is expressed in quantified and transitive algebraic forms of modern mathematics, and if the syllogism is itself a division, recombination, mixture, and automation of the activity of the division of the ideas and forms that shape the world, what we're doing with logic is not just writing things on the wall to conjure powers and spirits out of thin air, but rather it's a way of showing us how we can think reasonably about what follows from what, and how our conclusions can be shown by analysis to be true. I hope to argue that this can lead us to a better understanding of not only that God is, but also the nature of God in Christian and Trinitarian theology. So, to continue, and I hope this will satisfy our expectations for the study of logic, we can study not just the forms of logic, but also how logic can be useful for understanding the tenets of the Christian faith, what it means for our lives of faith, and also what it means for our lives and how we should act upon it in the future. So, when theologians are presenting themselves to the world, a skeptical audience, and other scientists, they're often asked if their object, their absolute object of their study, namely God, does not exist, then what is the truth of their study? Would it not be that everything they say about God is like, for instance, what you can say about Pokemon or what you can say about Mario, that it's completely frivolous because anything and everything could be true about it. It's only a matter of fiction, of how we sort of tell the story again or how we play the game again, that it appears true in this or that way. And that would be true if, as it were, there were no God, there were no face behind the icon that calls us to understand it in a more rich way. When asked these questions, theologians have often had recourse to what have been called the classical proofs of the existence of God. There's quite a lot to be said about this, both what can and cannot be known with them. It's important to remember that one's faith cannot be held with certainty and need not be held with certainty on the basis of a formal proof alone. If, for instance, we needed a formal proof, God would have given it to us. He would have written it on the stones that he gave to Moses. If, for instance, doubting Thomas needed a proof, Jesus would never have left. He would have stayed with him. He would have let him touch the wounds of Christ. So we don't need a proof in order to have belief in God, and arguably most Christians and most believers around the world have never had such a proof. But it does allow us to have a way of thinking towards, for, and of what God could mean for us in our lives. And for this reason, I think it is of some importance, and it also is a way of understanding how the forms of reasoning relate to God and how we can enter into the conversation of theology, not just of what that there is a God, but also what God could be. So, in the history of philosophy, there have been two kinds of approaches to this subject. One has been called a priori, which is prior to all sensations, all intuitions, and all experience of the world. It's an argument from pure reason, without regard to what we have or ever will be able to observe with our senses. The second is what's called an a posteriori proof, which is an argument posterior to or from the content of our sensation. That is, from what we can observe about the world and what it means for us and how we can think about it. Now, there are three kinds of arguments. Arguably, there's many more, hundreds if you might like, but you can analyze almost all of those arguments, I believe, into just three basic kinds. And those three kinds can be called the ontological argument, from being or ontos, the cosmological argument, from the world, from the cosmos, or the teleological argument, from the purpose, or the telos things. Now, I would argue that these three arguments are also related to one another, that the a posteriori arguments, namely the teleological and cosmological argument, can be analyzed into the ontological argument, which I want to present as the foremost proof of God's existence. So, what are these arguments? Let's start with the second. So, the cosmological argument is an argument from the world. It's an argument from the motion of things in the world to what would be the cause of that motion. Oftentimes this is called the argument from the first cause or the first mover. It's been made famous by Aristotle and by the Arabic scholastics, by Thomas Aquinas. It's often held to be the most important of the arguments for God's existence. It argues that if there is motion, which we all accept, and for every motion there must be a cause and an effect, and if there's a cause of an effect, we can analyze the effects to the causes, but if every cause in the finite world has a cause of itself, that for which it is not the cause, then there must be a cause of every cause. But if there is a cause of every cause, there must be an infinite sequence of causes. So for instance, if you ask, where did you come from? You did not come from nowhere, you did not come from the sun, you came from your parents. but your parents also had parents, and they had parents, and so on, all the way back. Now, if the first person,